Okay. Hey, what is up guys? I'm KBHD here, and this is not the first iPhone 5S review, and it probably won't be the last, but sometimes when you use the device for a while, longer than the typical review period for tech reviewers, you get a little bit of a better sense of what you like the device for and what you don't like it for, and just a little tidbits and quirks about it, and overall a general idea of how well you like to use it. And that's exactly what this video is about. This is an iPhone 5S review from the perspective of a person who uses a lot of Google services. I've done videos about iOS before. This is my first iPhone review. Believe it or not, this took me like 7 iPhones to actually do a review of it. But without any further ado, let's get right on into this. So this is the iPhone 5S in space gray. It comes in 3 colors, but this is the one I personally thought was my favorite. It's just as familiar as the rest of the iPhones out there. It's running iOS 7, it has that familiar array of icons like every other iPhone, and it's just as small. In fact, let me start by saying that yes, I'm aware that the iPhone looks very small in my hands, and that's because it is small in my hands. The Samsung Galaxy Note 3 is a phone I've carried for a while now, and it feels pretty natural for me to hold, but it's a bigger than average phone for most people, and it has a 5.7-inch display. But to me, it doesn't feel all that extreme. But a smaller, more common option that you'll probably see more frequently is the Samsung Galaxy S4. This is a pretty popular phone, and it has a 5-inch display. And it has that same general look to it as the Galaxy Note 3, but it takes up less space and involves reaching to the corners of it less. But even smaller than that is the Moto X. This is one of my favorite devices right now, and it's very compact. It stuffs a 4.7-inch display into a body that's not that much bigger than the iPhone, so I can grip the whole thing. But even this phone starts to look big when you compare it to the iPhone 5S. This phone has a 4-inch display, so it's easily the smallest of the displays on any flagship by any company right now, but it's also one of the most compact mobile devices, period, which is something that Apple's really proud of in this phone. And I don't blame them. The device is really light, really easy to hold, and people can reach all 4 corners of the display with one hand, although I think people could do that on a 4.5-inch display too. But this is also one of the most fragile feeling phones out there. It's not actually fragile. It's really extremely well built. It's made out of premium materials like the HTC One. It's got metal in there. It's very tightly put together. There's no creaking or any twisting or anything like that. But the lack of any curves, plus the glass on the back, like the Nexus 4, make it feel like I better not drop this device. Like if I dropped it from a few inches up, it feels like it's very delicate and vulnerable to scratches, like I should be putting a case on it or something. Now there are a couple of things about the battery in this device. It's, like we said, a 1,570 milliamp hour battery, and that measurement is pretty small. In fact, this entire iPhone is about the same size as the Galaxy Note 3 battery, which is over 3,000 milliamp hours. So with this having half the battery size as a Note 3 has its pros and has its cons. One of the important pros is that it charges very quickly. I'd like to say it charges lightning fast. But the cons are immediately that the battery doesn't last quite as long as any other smartphone out there with a larger battery. Now, standby times are excellent on the iPhone. I could go to sleep with an iPhone at 100% battery, not charge it, and it would wake up with 97% battery. That's pretty good. An Android device with a similar size battery might be at 80% when you wake up. So that's pretty good that iOS takes good advantage of what it thinks you should be closing in the background when you're sleeping. But it doesn't have the best battery life during actual use. In fact, it's not even quite as good as the iPhone 5. I'd say maybe 5% worse than the iPhone 5. But it's about the same battery life as you'd expect from an iPhone. So if you're coming from a previous generation iPhone, you won't find too many surprises here with the battery life. Everything else about the hardware, though, is very well crafted. We saw this in the iPhone 5, too. It's solid aluminum on the sides and the back. It has awesome buttons that are precisely crafted so that they don't wobble at all, which is nice. Plus, they have the laser etchings to indicate volume up and down. The chamfered edges are angled ever so slightly inwards. The headphone jack and the lightning port are on the bottom with the precisely milled speaker grill holes. I mean, I don't think it's just about how all of this is in such a small package that makes it a little difficult to appreciate it all, which is why I think HTC One still feels just as good in the hand. Now, the speakers on the bottom of the iPhone are one of the more interesting parts of it. I expected them to be really good, but check this out. There are 2 speaker grills at the bottom of the iPhone. That looks great. It looks like stereo speakers. But it's actually just a single driver. The right-hand side sort of echoes over to the left-hand side. So if you cover up the left-hand side, you will hear no change in the sound. But if you cover up the right-hand side where the driver is, you can completely mute the speaker. So you have to be sure not to do that by accident. I'll give you a sample of the sound. It's completely muted. Well, anyway, like we've said, the iPhone has obviously familiar hardware on the outside, but what about the inside? Because that's where the main change came from between the 5 and the 5S. Now, if you thought the Moto X was a consumer-oriented device that didn't care about specs and targeted the average consumer, wait till you see the spec sheet of the iPhone 5S. It has, on paper, the same specs as, literally, not even exaggerating, a flagship from 2011. Meet the Samsung Galaxy S2. Release date, April 2011. Inside, it had a dual-core 1.2 GHz chip, 1 GB of RAM, 32 GB of storage, an 8 megapixel camera, and a 1650 mAh battery. Now meet the iPhone 5S. Release date, a couple weeks ago. It has a dual-core 1.3 GHz chip, 1 GB of RAM, 32 GB of storage, an 8 megapixel camera, and a 1570 mAh battery. So this is where Apple does its absolute best to make sure specs don't matter nearly as much as they used to. They control the entire experience from the hardware to the software, and there's a lot of optimization going on, and in the end, performance throughout iOS 7 is pretty snappy. It performs on par with just about every other flagship today that has an 8-core chip and double the RAM and 20 megapixel cameras. And iOS, as we know, never really required all that much resources to run smoothly and multitask well and not eat through battery life like a hungry wolf through steak, so it's not really a surprise that the iPhone 5S is quite fast, especially when compared to older iPhones. But how is iOS 7? Well, for me, I actually like the look of iOS 7, at least a lot of it, but its functionality is still exactly the same as iOS 6. It's essentially a layer of gloss over the top, a visual overhaul, if you will. The motto here is you'll probably like it or learn to like it, but if you don't, too bad. Because you just can't change things. You still can't customize a lot of the things that I'm used to being able to customize out of the box on something like an Android phone. In iOS 7, you'll probably like most of the new icons, but if you don't like one, or two, or several, too bad. You might like the new keyboard, but if you don't, too bad. You might love the new stock lock screen or the new dialer or all the new stock applications, but if you don't, too bad. My biggest gripe with iOS 7 was actually the animation. So every time I unlock the iPhone 5S, there's this new animation in iOS 7 that takes a solid half a second before it lets me do anything on the home screen, and I don't like that at all. And that's too bad. So now anytime I want to unlock the phone, and I already know I want to go to the second page of apps, I have to wait for the animation to finish before I can do anything, because while it's animating, it's unresponsive on the touchscreen. Still bugs me to this day. I wish I could change the animation speed, just speed it up a little bit. There's also a lot of weird little bits of fragmentation, like with the keyboard, for example, where if the app you're using isn't updated for iOS 7, it doesn't get to use Apple's new keyboard. It'll use the old iOS 7 looking keyboard, which creates a bit of visual inconsistency, and that will, I guess, be a bit of a mess until app developers get on the case and update their apps for the new OS. But overall, yeah, I like the look of a lot of iOS 7. I think it's quite nice in a lot of areas that aren't the icons on the home screen, but the functionality I still have problems with, and those still remain, and that's too bad. Now, outside of this, of course, iOS is still a great choice for a lot of people, and that obviously won't change. I mean, 10 million people bought this phone the first weekend it was available, so it's clear that people love it and want it. As a Google service user with stuff, like Gmail, Google Drive, Google Calendar, Tasks, etc., you can get most of the core stuff you need and get away with it from the App Store, so the situation is really not that bad at all. And then there are, of course, the few fringe benefits of the iPhone, like Touch ID, for example, which is the name for the fancy fingerprint sensor in the home button of the iPhone. Lets you unlock your phone or authenticate your iTunes purchases, and you can register up to 10 fingers. Of course, people have also found great ways to register things other than fingers, like their toes, their pet's toes, and even other body parts. But it's a cool feature. It works pretty well, pretty accurately most of the time. Just note that every time you restart your phone, you'll have to re-enter your whole iTunes password before using Touch ID in the App Store again. Another thing that's great about the iPhone is the camera experience. The camera experience, in my opinion, is made up of two different parts. It's the quality and the control. And there's a little bit of a scale, I'd say, between 1 and 10 for quality and between 1 and 10 for control. A lot of devices that have 10 out of 10 for quality, like the Lumia 1020, for example, you can't just give it to a random person on the street and ask them to take a great photo with it. They'll probably have a little bit of difficulty. But if you get a really, really easy to use camera, chances are it's not going to take great photos. So the iPhone strikes a nice balance because on the scale of 1 to 10 for quality, it's around an 8. And on the scale of 1 to 10 for control, it's pretty simple, but it's an easy-to-use app, so that's another 8 out of 10. And I think that is what makes it a very likable camera. You can just open it with a swipe up from the shortcut in the corner and immediately begin to take pictures. I would characterize the camera on the back of the iPhone 5S as a very fast camera in a bunch of different ways. Fast number 1 because it's very fast to take photos and to process shots. Fast number 2 because taking HDRs is very quick, so you don't have to have a necessarily still subject. Fast number 3 because the aperture itself is very fast, is wide open. I believe it's f2.0 or 2.2, which can be a little bit softer than the iPhone 5, but still is plenty fast and great for low light. And again, fast because of the video modes in here. You can take really fast 120 frames per second video and then slow it down to 30 frames per second to get this awesome smooth slow motion effect. So this is a very fast camera. What I most enjoyed about shooting with the 5S's camera though was the low light capabilities. This thing can essentially see in the dark where a lot of the other camera phones I've used fall short. But you can see all the test shots that I took in the full Imgur link in the description right below that like button, where you'll see, low light shots and regular light shots. And you'll see that the photos it takes are really pretty solid. The colors were very accurate, like extremely colorful and saturated. The detail was pretty much all there. It was only a little bit softer than the iPhone 5 because of the wider aperture, but overall, the shots you get out of this thing are very good. Overall though, in terms of the quality of photos and videos you get, and the control you have over them, this is up there in some of the best smartphones you can get to take photos with. So yeah, using the iPhone 5S is just as you would expect. You get great performance, smooth animations throughout, you get that super compact form factor and excellent build quality and design and material choices, and you get the usual quirks with a relatively new operating system, but those will either iron out or you'll get used to them. You get that future-proofness with the new 64-bit architecture, Apple's new chip, and Apple having control over the whole OS and ecosystem. And you have a very reliable device that almost always works exactly as you'd expect it to. Even if you don't like the way it does something, you can be confident that it'll do it that way every single time until you get used to it. It's a very familiar device for a lot of people, and probably isn't worth rushing to upgrade to if you're coming from an iPhone 5, but from any other older iPhone, it's a great choice for all it's worth. So at the end of the day, there are some things that I really like about the iPhone, and some things that I really don't like, obviously, about the iPhone, that a lot of other people will probably agree with. The display is one of the most polarizing things to me. I love the quality of the display, I just wish it was bigger. And there are a lot of things that I like about the build. It's a beautifully crafted device. It's just a little bit too small and feels a little bit fragile, even though it is, in fact, really sturdy, no creaking or bending at all. So there are some polarizing things about it. At the end of the day, though, I'm not a big iOS user. If you want to see a full dedicated iOS review or sort of a video on just me and iOS, feel free to leave a comment below or a thumbs up if you want to see something like that. But either way, this has been it. This is the iPhone 5S in space gray. Thank you for watching the review, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.